Hello there. I'm Robert Prentice. I teach business law and business ethics at the McCombs School. And until fairly recently, I thought CSR was a model of Honda that I thought I might want to drive. I've gotten a little more up to date recently. In the last year, in fact, at the McCombs School, we've had a series of speakers on CSR, many of whom I would consider to be inspiring. Big companies, small companies, for-profits, non-profits. I know a lot more about this topic than I did before, and I think I've come to the conclusion that just as at the end of my life, I wouldn't want its success to be judged by how much money I had in the bank account. If I were running a business, I would not want its success just to be measured by how much money we made. And I think there are a fair number of people out there, employees, suppliers, investors, who've come to a similar conclusion and want more and expect more from the companies they come into contact with. Not everybody agrees. That's what makes it a horse race, and that's why we should have a lively discussion today. We have the good fortune, our discussion is going to be led and moderated by Pablo Schneider. If I gave you all of his credentials, we'd be here a very long time, so I'm just going to mention that he's been associated with the LBJ School, he just told me, for more than 15 years, which we appreciate. Always nice to have ties to Texas. He's been a consultant in the areas of marketing and strategy and corporate governance for more than 15 years, big companies, small companies, private firms, public companies, for-profit, non-profit. For our benefit, he's been a consultant in the corporate governance area for more than 14 years, so he knows a lot about this field, and I give you Pablo Schneider.
Thank you. Is my mic on? Great. Well, we have three terrific panelists today, and they've asked us to make it an informal discussion and dialogue. So what I'm going to do is introduce each panelist and then kick it off with a question, and we'll take it from there. So we have Sonia Perez, who's the president of AT&T Louisiana, and their bios are in the book, so you can read all the details as you can on mine. We have David Spence, associate professor at the McCombs School, and he's a professor of business, government, and society. And then Hector Ruiz, CEO of Bull Ventures, former CEO of AMD. And in thinking about corporate social responsibility, I was checking around a little bit, and there is actually something called the CSR Wire. And that's like PR Newswire, Hispanic PR Wire, etc. And then the CSR Wire is the Corporate Social Responsibility Newswire. And I want to just take a couple of minutes to kind of tee up the conversation. And according to CSR Wire, the way they define it is CSR is the integration of business operations and values whereby the interests of all stakeholders, including investors, customers, employees, the community, and the environment, are reflected in the company's policies and actions. And the press releases that have come out on CR Wire just in the past few days, I'm going to give you some examples, and then we'll go in with the question discussion with the panelists. Johnson Controls releases annual business and sustainability performance metrics. Aspen Institute names emerging leaders as 2011 Henry Crown Fellows. Creating Wealth by Sharing Wealth, a story about the Foundation for Enterprise Development. Kohl's Department Stores announces second annual nationwide volunteer event. We'll give $2 million to local nonprofits in celebration of National Volunteer Week and Earth Day. SAI asks companies to find their social fingerprint. George Mason University launches the first annual CSR seminar. Leaders in employee community engagement set to convene at Volunteer Match Client Summit. Johnson Controls globally recognized by FTSE4 Good Index Series. Baxter and its foundation expand access to healthcare and education through 2010 charitable contributions. And those are just for the last few days. So those are headlines from the CSR Wire. So I'd like to kick it off with a question and ask each panelist to answer, starting with Sonia. And that is, from your perspective, what are the one or two most pressing issues of corporate social responsibility today?
Well, at AT&T, thank you, Pablo. At AT&T, we think of corporate social responsibility and sustainability, actually probably in a much broader sense than people typically think of it. I think when you talk to business people across the globe and you ask about corporate social responsibility, you ask about sustainability, they might refer to the environment and green technology and that kind of thing. And we think of it as a much broader sense. We think about it in terms of, first and foremost, integrity and hiring employees and operating at the highest standards of integrity and responsibility, and making sure that every level of employee understands that first and foremost. So integrity is number one. Number two, I would have to say that it's inventing, building, distributing products and services and devices that are mutually beneficial for society, right? And then we even go so far as to include diversity and healthy communities as part of that equation. So for AT&T, it's not just two things. It includes diversity and making sure that our people and the vendors that we do business with, the minority suppliers that we do business with, are reflective of our customers in every way, because the more we look like our customers, the more we act like our customers, the better jobs we can provide, the more we can grow and provide the services and products that our customers are looking for. So you get into integrity, you get into inventing, you get into diversity, and then the healthy communities, the jobs that we create, the taxes that we pay. We provide a reliable tax base everywhere we operate, and we're very, very proud of that. So there are four things really, not just two, that we focus on in terms of operating as a business every single day of the week.
Okay, David?
Well, when I first heard the question, I was thinking about specific issues like the environment or workers' rights or human rights or diversity, those kinds of things that you see in corporate social responsibility reports. But I think those tend to be, what's important is sort of industry specific. So for me, one of the biggest things is one of the biggest changes in CSR over the last decade or so is how changes in technology have allowed interested parties, stakeholders, to press their interests on companies faster and more effectively than ever before. And so companies have become more strategic about their CSR investments, the kinds of things they do, where they used to perhaps give money to the local food bank or Philharmonic, just sort of general giving. We see now CSR programs targeted toward the stakeholders, the important stakeholders of that company, and those can differ from industry to industry. So I do a lot of work with the energy industry where safety and environment are among the most important issues, but in retail it might be something completely different. It's all about sort of strategic targeting, I think, of CSR investments now. That's one set of issues. The other that sort of goes along with that, I think, is the changing relationship between governments and stakeholders and business. Whereas we might used to have looked to government to sort of take care of establishing standards for behavior and enforcing them through the law, we see businesses in the global economy doing business in places where there might not be much law in the first place, and so that puts more of an onus on businesses to step up to the plate and go beyond mere compliance with the law. And we see sort of a deregulatory trend or less support for regulation here in the United States, which also has sort of led businesses, I think, to step into the breach a little bit and strengthen or broaden their CSR programs that way. So those are the two things that pop to mind for me.
Well, it's interesting to note, along the lines of your second observation about government, stakeholders, and business, there's an international standards organization standard now for CSR, ISO 26000. So as we get in the conversation, maybe you could comment on that as well. Hector.
Well, maybe I'll take a slightly different view of my experience when I was a Fortune 500 CEO for 10 years, and I now realize all the things I should have done relative to CSR that I wish I could live another 100 years so I could be smarter than I was for the last 100. But and I'm going to borrow some of a fellow named Dr. Porter that you probably know in Harvard that has done some work on this. I'm going to borrow some of his terminology because it's easier for me then to explain what I'm thinking about. you know, there are three things companies tend to be involved with. One is philanthropy, and they usually make that a budget item, a line item. And what happens is that line item changes dramatically depending on the economic conditions. And so, but they do that, and it's a good thing they do, but it's very subject to the ups and downs, and very few people in the company are intimately connected with that. Then there's another thing they get involved with, which has to be with propaganda. That means there are things that are popular that people want to hear about, and the company sees that as an opportunity to make a propaganda item out of it. And I'm not saying that in a negative way or being critical, it's just the way it is done, it occurs. But there is a third one that I think is really important and then determines the answer to your question, Pablo, is that, and it's called share value creation. And what some people believe, and I actually subscribe to that, is that the big opportunity for global growth in companies is going to come out of this share value creation. And what that means is that being able to partner with the communities in which the companies operate to identify and create something of share value. That's very enduring. And let me use one example of that is, if a company is making solar cell panels in Texas and gets a big contract to go up by 100 times in production, the first inclination is to respond to shareholder value by saying, perhaps we should move to Asia, where labor is cheaper. That may be a totally appropriate decision to consider in the light of creating shareholder value. But if you're thinking more progressively and you think, well, what could be a share value with a community, is to work with the government and the local entities to say, would it be possible for us to achieve the same cost savings that we have in Asia if we put an effort for the next 3 years to fully automate our factory, to fully train our people, retrain people, et cetera, and then build this enduring value that goes well beyond just a one-shot deal. I really believe that those are then, the answer to your question, Pablo, is dependent on the location. So when today's companies are very global, and depending whether you're operating in Vietnam, Dresden, Germany, or Austin, Texas, the determination of what that priority could be for the company is based on the opportunity for creating share value.
Terrific. I was just going to say, and now that you've each talked a little bit about, you know, sort of what's top of mind, we're going to go into a process where you guys can interject, or if you want to piggyback on something, and of course Sonia now is going to piggyback on what Hector said, so perfect.
I am, and I think Hector is absolutely correct. I think as a responsible corporate citizen, you have to, even on short-term initiatives, have to implement them based on long-term effectiveness. The term short-term sustainability certainly is an oxymoron, and the term long-term sustainability is redundant. That's why we're very big in education. Education over the last 4 years, or last 3 years, we have created an Aspire education program where we funded $100 million in this country to prevent increase of a high school dropout situation. We have to have an educated workforce that will help us align and innovate and invent products and create services so that we can retain the customers, so that we can continue to grow those jobs. And without an educated workforce, we're unable to do that. We believe that the education is in crisis. Education is in crisis across this country. You have 1/3 of high school students that drop out. For the African American, the Native American, and certainly the Hispanic community, that percentage is half. It's 50% of students are dropping out, and that's a crisis for this country on multiple levels. And when our CEO, Randall Stevenson, took over the chairmanship of the corporation, he said that is the one thing that we're going to focus on as a foundation, because it's going to impact us short-term and long-term. And he put his money where his mouth was, and we are funding proven effective dropout reduction programs all across the country.
Yeah, recently there's an organization called the National Association of Corporate Directors. It's over 10,000 board members who serve on 850 of the Fortune 1000, and NACD is sort of the who's who of board members in America. And recently there was an event where the topic was corporate social responsibility, and it was a debate. And they had one person debate that corporations have no social responsibility, that corporations are only responsible to their shareholders, period. And then the other side was that corporations do have a corporate social responsibility, and here's why. So what do you all say to those who say that there's no such thing, that corporations don't have a responsibility to education, to the environment, to other stakeholders outside the shareholders, shareholder value, and that those directly connect with the company? And I could see you're like ready to go, Sonia. So how about you first, and then David, then Hector?
Business and society do not exist independently of each other. Business and society are totally interdependent. Society needs a good, stable economic base. Our communities need to be healthy communities, growing jobs. Companies are paying taxes and contributing to the vibrant health of communities. That's where we get our workforce. That's where we get our customers. That's how our children get educated. That's how we provide stability in an economy. That's how corporations do it. They do not exist independently. They very much have to exist. As a company who invested $18 billion in this country last year, we are totally invested in our communities everywhere our people live and work and where our customers exist. We have to care because we cannot grow the business in a positive way if we're not doing mutually beneficial things for the communities in which we operate.
David?
I agree with Sonia. When we talk about this in MBA classrooms, we'll sometimes see MBA students making the argument that shareholder return is all that matters, and that's kind of I think in a sort of a short-term way. But if you've just come out of a class where you've studied sort of pure economic models, or you've read Adam Smith, or you've read Milton Friedman, that's an understandable point of view that you might come away with, but we almost never see that among alums who are out in the world. The people who are out in the world recognize that companies derive their license to operate, which is the phrase they typically use now, from the community, from the political, economic, social, ethical system in which they exist. And so they know that they have to contribute to that community in a variety of ways in order to maintain that license to operate. And you can imagine ways in which companies that don't do that might find laws changing in ways that hurt the business, protests, other forms of sort of blowback from that sort of irresponsible behavior. But even without that, most of the companies that we see, most of the people that come back to campus with experience in the working world and the business world, especially leaders like the people on either side of me, usually have a much deeper appreciation for the importance of that sort of investment.
Hector?
Well, two things, Pablo, that are really critical here. First of all, the reality of things. In my 10 years as CEO of a company, not once did I have a shareholder ask me about corporate social responsibility. So, and shareholders are difficult to define, frankly. My company was owned 60% by institutional investors, which means there are people that represent a large number of investors, and so there's not a sort of an intimate connection with your shareholder from that perspective. The retailer investor gets smaller and smaller every day, so it's not as easy to connect as a shareholder. But what I realize, and I see that now, and Sonia's company is an example of that, is it takes courage for the CEO and the board of directors of a company to do what makes sense and is right. And it's not easy. It's much easier, frankly, in most places. And I know, because I've been in those meetings where much easier to say, why don't we take the company from here to Vietnam because they're only paid 25 cents an hour, and the board will clap and tell you that's a great move to make because it's going to improve profitability. That's a much easier discussion to have than if CEO goes in front of the board to say, we're going to invest the next 3 years to retrain people in Texas. And the reason I keep picking Texas, by the way, is because South Texas, the Valley, is a place where we have this rich talented people that are not employed. We have almost a 25% unemployment rate down there. that imagine if we could retrain them and build an organization that's can create this share value. That's a tougher discussion to have, and it takes real courage for a CEO of a public company and the board to support a decision like that, because it doesn't have that immediate impact. And what I think, if I had to pick one thing that I would love to see change in us, is to encourage CEOs and boards to have that courage, because I really think is needed. And if I could just make one last little comment here, which I think is really critical, and that is the point that Sonia was making about education. Imagine a few years back, I remember when I was being sold the idea of moving some of my operations to China. Back in those days, this was 20 years ago, China did not have an educated workforce. China did not have a system of education that was very good. What did have was very low-cost labor. And we finally got conned as companies. We got fooled by the analysis that labor was the key issue. And it's now become apparent, the last time I was there, which was only a few months ago, when I was visiting this tennis shoe factory, and all of a sudden I realized that there were no people in it. The Chinese have perfected the automation of making tennis shoes. So it made me think about the fact that if we hadn't taken that cheap solution 20, 30 years ago, and we had made the investments to learn how to do things better and differently, we could be making all our tennis shoes and blue jeans and things like that here, but it requires that courage. So I go back to that, is the courage of leaders to really do what makes sense in a longer term and sell shareholders on the idea that share value over a longer period of time is going to benefit everybody.
Yeah, one thing you'll notice in the comments is that there's a thread through several of the comments, and that has to do with tone at the top. If you'll notice, there was several mentions of board, in particular board and C-level. So could you talk about, what comes to mind when you think about the impact of culture on corporate social responsibility, the tone at the top, the board, the management having the courage to do it, because it does take courage. It is an investment that usually something costs money sometime somewhere. And if you could talk a little bit about tone at the top and culture, but also the sense that you have maybe of some companies that are very admired for having a strong culture of corporate social responsibility, and then perhaps examples of companies that are not admired or even vilified. And that's actually a pretty good segue from the last panel to this one. And just a quick aside, I asked Saul Trujillo, who's been a good friend for a long time, and he chairs the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee of the Target Board of Directors. And I asked him, do you think corporate social responsibility creates shareholder value, number one? Number two, does it help a company either prevent crises, or does it help them in times of crisis? And he said undoubtedly yes to both. So what are your thoughts, Sonia, on tone at the top and how culture impacts corporate social responsibility, and any companies that come to mind either positively or companies that perhaps might lack or have not demonstrated corporate social responsibility?
I'm going to start it by saying that I have almost 32 years of service with a company that's a dynamic Fortune 7 company. I'm a girl from Hondo, Texas, who was born to migrants. Okay, I went to the University of Texas, very proud to have my degree from here, and never thought that I would work in a position like the one I am now. It's president of AT&T Louisiana. When you have a company that recognizes the talent of diversity and is proud to be number 3 on the Diversity Inc. list in terms of diversity and inclusion, you recognize that the CEO, the leadership at the top of the corporation, is embracing everything that it takes in order to grow the business in a way that's going to impact the future for all the employees, for the 265,000 employees that we have across the globe, for all our customers. And certainly AT&T has always been a company that did that. I have to tell you that diversity for us is very big. Look at today. The keynote speaker was the head of AT&T Mobility, Ralph de la Vega, right? I'm the president of AT&T Louisiana. I am one of 5 women presidents in the southeastern part of the United States of America. To me, that says a lot about the company that we work for. Because what comes out of that are things like the fact that we provide services to our customers in 160 languages in this country. We have outfit 700 of our call centers and outlets to be able to service customers in over 160 languages. So when you talk about the culture at the top, and you talk about courage and being brave, yes, that's all a part of it. And that's why a company can remain viable, why a company's leaders must be visionary from the standpoint of how you continue to evolve, how you create a mobile broadband revolution unlike any that we've seen, how you take customers to the edge of technology with products like the iPhone. It's that kind of corporate culture that also embraces things like employee resource groups for veterans, for gays and lesbians, for women of AT&T, for Hispanics, Hacemos. We have members of our Hacemos group here today. When you have a company that embraces African American employees in a group called The Network, you know that you're working for a company that is not only brave and courageous, but it's also doing the right thing because leadership believes that. And the type of people that they put in place to execute that is also reflective of that thought process. I don't know if I answered your question quite the way you were looking for.
It's okay.
But
I was just interested in what you were thinking.
But everything that we do, the way we operate, the way we deal with our customers is inherent in terms of corporate social responsibility.
Do you see any other companies out in the landscape that you admire?
I'd have to turn that over to the academic consultant in the room.
David?
I was waiting for the headline, Sonia slams Company X.
I could arrange that, Sonia, if you want to name anybody. No, it's okay.
Let me answer that the most recent question after answering your prior question. I just wanted to underscore something that we heard in Sonia's answer about when you talked about the setting the tone at the top. So there's two parts to that. You can establish goals and policies and disseminate them among the employees, but you also have to walk the walk, and it sounds like AT&T is walking the walk. That's all the examples you used were really about things the company does, not only the things they say. And so if you go on to CSR Wire, which by the way is a really interesting website, csrwire.org, I think it is. .com, sorry, I should know. But you can look up all of the current CSR reports that companies publish each year. And there's no shortage of great policy statements. But it's that follow-up that really matters. And so if you make positive examples of people who do the hard things, the things that don't look, at least in the short term, like they're necessarily benefiting the bottom line, but they are benefiting these policy goals that the company has, if you find ways to reward those people and reward those actions, and as I say, make a positive example of those people, that tells the employees, yeah, we really mean this. And that results can also create positive morale, more increased productivity, retention of employees, pride in working there, all that sort of thing. So I think that the culture matters. I want to just say one more thing about culture. If in some industries there's a culture that's extremely competitive, and sometimes people borrow the culture of sports, a sports team, and I think that can be that can be a culture that can create problems for good sort of responsible behavior at times, because in a sports competition, you rely on the referee to call the fouls. You don't call them on yourselves, unless it's golf, I guess you call them on yourself in golf. But And so if if you start to treat the competition in the business environment, in the workplace, like something that someone else has to referee, and you don't have to referee yourself, that's the kind of culture that can get you in trouble. And so an example of a company that got in trouble for that very reason, I think, at least in my opinion, Enron would be sort of the poster child for that. There was a sort of really competitive, sort of think outside the box, even to the point of bending or breaking the rules sort of culture there. And that sort of creativity was rewarded, but it also got people in trouble with regulators, both in the accounting field and in the energy field. So that's an example of a company that obviously didn't do it well. Even though they had all the right statements, by the way, they had all the right corporate policies, at least if you read them on paper, they just weren't being put into practice. Examples of companies that do well, I think I would again resist the idea of saying somebody does all of CSR well, but I would talk about particular issues. So when it comes, so Whole Foods has a reputation here in town of being strong on a number of elements of CSR, including sort of giving to the community and also treatment of workers kinds of issues. Within the field that I know best, energy, ExxonMobil, really strong on safety. Has an almost unbelievably good safety record since Exxon Valdez, which brings me to another point, which is that sometimes these kinds of programs are spurred by problems. But,
they're motivated or triggered by events.
Yeah, a number of the sort of outdoors gear companies are very strong in environmental issues. Human rights issues, if you do business overseas, a lot of the other extractive industries, not just oil and gas, but mining, some of those companies have, again, because of problems they've had in the past, become very strong on human rights treatment of people in places where the government doesn't protect human rights, those sorts of issues. So there's a lot of good stories out there.
Yeah.
Bad ones too.
Well, and that's a good point, too, and to connect that to something that Ralph said about the kind of behavior of the company, and in particular companies that are operating globally. That Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a big, nasty monster with sharp teeth. Yeah. And it was created in response to a whole bunch of bribery and corruption cases back in the 70s. Right. Companies all over the world. And if you're an American citizen or an American company, and you bribe government officials around the world, you are subject, regardless of who you are or where you live. If you are an American or an American company, subject to all kinds of criminal penalties, civil penalties. I mean, it is nasty. Hector.
You know, my view is that the culture at the top is a must. I mean, without it, I just don't think it's possible for a company to exhibit the things that are really necessary to be a good share value company in the sense that I described earlier. So I think the top is a must. And that by the top, you're talking about the CEO, the board, and a few executives. And once they walk the walk, as they've said, it's really contagious. People will see it. It almost gives them permission to do things like that. So I really think that top thing is a must. I mean, without it, I don't think I've ever seen a company be good at it without the leadership at the top that insists that this is part of their culture. Cultures take time to change, so if a company doesn't have it, I don't think you can get it overnight. So it takes time to change. But companies that have it are really pretty strong in it, and they're very hard to change the other way, that way too. And as David pointed out, not everybody does all those things well, but there are people that stand out on the specific things. You know, I just watched an interview on NPR radio with the CEO of Starbucks. And apparently, according to the interview, ever since Starbucks was founded, every employee, even their only part-time employees, get health care benefits. And that during the most difficult times of the company, which they went through some pretty challenging times a few years ago, one of the things that he, as CEO, made the decision with the support of the board, because it's a public company, is that was one thing that we're not going to touch. And that's kind of interesting. So, you know, there's an example of a strongly opinionated CEO with a strong sense of values, driving that hard and making it stick, and that's the culture of that company. And so, again, the top leadership, the culture is a must.
So, Hector, would you argue that corporate social responsibility increases shareholder value? And is it different short-term, mid-term, long run? Short-term, mid-term, long-term? Because one of the things Sonia said is short-term sustainability is an oxymoron, and long-term sustainability is sort of self-explanatory, right? It's redundant. So the question is, would you argue that CSR increases shareholder value? And then also, David, you mentioned something about the benefits of corporate social responsibility. So what do you think, Hector, and then David?
Well, Sonia's right about those statements, by the way. I like the, it's an oxymoron, short-term sustainability. But I think that because so many things get developed a bad, acronyms end up being sometimes develop bad connotation. I think we're in danger of CSR becoming that. So I think we have to be careful with that. It's kind of like in the old days, people began to talk about quality control and things that really should have been embedded in the culture of the company. And so I would be very suspicious if we have an organization that creates a department that's called CSR. And I think there has to be more than that. It has to be embedded in the company. So if you define it right, in my view, as I said earlier, is define it as shared value. You're working in the communities in which you operate to find some way that you're creating a value that's going to be sustained over a long period of time and shared by the community, then absolutely, that leads directly to increasing shareholder value, makes the company a place to work, to want to work. The ideal outcome of an appropriately implemented shared value concept in a community is that if you wanted to choose the place you wanted your family to go work, your children and your grandchildren, it would be that company.
And David, what about benefits of a corporation being very social responsibility, very socially responsible, or perhaps risks or disadvantages of not being socially responsible, in particular in crisis kinds of situations? So what's the upside? What's the downside of not doing it? And also, I have a quick follow-on question, but go ahead and answer that one first.
So in terms of the benefits that I think managers believe they get from investing in corporate social responsibility, and I also agree with both speakers that these probably do exist, but I just want to caution that I don't think they're always quantitatively demonstrated to exist. But I think managers believe they exist, and I believe they exist, and so that's why these investments keep getting made. But one of them I already mentioned, which is sort of internal benefits to the company in the form of employee morale, productivity, retention, and all that sort of thing. Another obviously would be reputational. A lot of us, Hector called it propaganda earlier, but it's letting people, if people know that you're doing the right thing. If, Walmart had been suffering, for example, from some fairly bad press prior to Hurricane Katrina.
Big lawsuit now too.
Yeah. Lots of lawsuits, women. Yeah. But when Hurricane Katrina happened and government couldn't get anything in there to help people, Walmart was one of the first companies that got supplies into New Orleans. So presumably...
Has anybody heard that? Anybody heard that? Raise your hand. So out of everybody, maybe less than 10% of people. So, I didn't know that.
Yeah, maybe it's. I'm hoping it's not a representative sample, but I do think that reputational benefits are at least part of the motive for doing this, doing some of this work. That doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do, and that's not also a motive.
Well, what I was illustrating with that is I think a lot of times, as the last panel mentioned, there's that siloing. Mm-hmm. And Hector, you also mentioned that as a risk too, like sometimes CSR is kind of off to the side. Yeah. And maybe people don't know how good companies are, how good they do. How many people knew that Target gives a lot back to the community, like 5% of all their profits? So a little bit more, but still a fairly small number. So sorry for interrupting.
No, that's okay. So I think that's right. I mean, we had a speaker yesterday from ExxonMobil who works in this field, and he talked also about science, technology, engineering, and math education as another company that focuses on these issues. And obviously they publicize that. They try to let the world know they do that. Commercials this week. The Masters will be on, and Phil Nicholson will be talking about his ExxonMobil. How many have
seen the ExxonMobil commercials focusing on science, technology, engineering, and math? They've been running a ton of them.
Yeah. So And that's true of lots of companies. They publicize this stuff, and to some people that leads them to sort of say, well, is that really are you doing good for the right reasons? And that's a sort of a separate but related question to whether or not they're doing good. So I think reputational effects, morale effects, and I think there are managers out there who also do it because they think it's the right thing to do. With the sort of the generalized belief that we're part of the community and we need to invest in the community. And so I think all three of those things are at work there. And there was another part of your question which I've forgotten.
Actually, it was just going to be a follow-on question, and you answered it.
Okay, good.
And that was about quantitative versus qualitative return. There's a concept called return on responsibility. And there are actually people working on helping to try and quantify that. Certainly qualitatively you can describe it in metrics and reports and other things, but there's actually a little movement afoot to articulate return on responsibility. Sonia.
When you talk about, to pick up on what David said, when you talk about why corporations, there's a question about why they're really publicizing what they do. We think it's very important that our own employees understand what we do because we need to communicate it to them. We, as someone who just got finished conducting a slew of employee sessions across the state of Louisiana, I can tell you that they like to hear everything that we're involved with. I think that what you said tends to happen. There tends to be a siloing, and certainly, people need to keep, stay in their seat and do the job and do it well, and they do, but they also like to know how they're contributing as a bigger cog in the wheel, a cog in the bigger wheel. And we find that really, I like to think of it, pumps up the base. And if you can pump up your base of employees with information, letting them know what you're doing for the community, letting them know things like in my own state, spending almost $5 million in philanthropy last year, largely for educational programs. They feel very good to be associated with a company like that. They feel good about knowing how much in taxes we pay, how big our payroll is, the kind of causes that we're supporting. They like to read about that. They like to be able to talk about that. And it's important because you know what? Going back to what kind of goodwill it creates for you and your community. They live next door to the community leaders. They volunteer at the nonprofits. They know the mayor. They grew up with them. Their kids go to school with her kids' school. It's her kids' school. And it all, I think, begins with the employee base. You make believers out of your employee base. They're your biggest fans out there.
The tip of the spear.
Pumping up the base is huge, yes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, kind of shifting gears, and I'm going to throw you a little curveball. It's kind of a hard question. I was looking at CSR Wire, and one of the headlines said, Heineken, the beer company. Heineken launches HIV/AIDS program. And it got me to thinking, what are some of the issues around corporate social responsibility for companies that make alcohol, tobacco, and firearms? I mean, that's kind of tough. And I'll start with you, David, since you're the professor among us. What's the thinking out there in the landscape about companies that make products that are arguably harmful? Can a company still be, socially responsible, even if their products are basically harmful?
Yeah.
Certainly, alcohol not in moderation, tobacco not in moderation, and firearms not in moderation. I think you could argue they're harmful.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever talked about this with anyone from a firearms company, but we took a group of students to Russia a couple of years ago and met with a major cigarette manufacturer there. And as you may know, the only growth markets for cigarettes are in developing countries
yeah.
and places where they feel they can people still haven't been educated essentially on the health.
There's not as much regulation, perhaps.
Right. And so a lot of the issues there, those countries are going through the same thing that we went through about whether or not to start limiting advertising and those sorts of things.
And
the arguments,
more taxes.
Yeah, more taxes. The arguments that the companies make is that this is a free choice issue, is the way they defend themselves in these cases. Many people don't find that terribly persuasive as an argument against regulation. But most of these companies, at least on the cigarette side, and I think also true on the beverages side, alcoholic beverages side, are sufficiently diversified, but they make other products as well. And they do invest in corporate social responsibility. I don't think their investments in corporate social responsibility are as strategically targeted to at least those vice products. I mean, they're separated. They're essentially separating themselves from that when they make those investments. So I'm not aware, and I should say I haven't read their reports recently, so I'm not aware of where their target initiatives are. But the people we talked to a couple of years ago did invest in corporate social responsibility. It was not in any way connected to
their product.
Cigarettes, so it wasn't about emphysema research or anything like that. So they still engage in it, but you're right, they have a difficult reputational issue associated with their product.
Well, it's interesting, the alcohol companies, at one point in time you could see they kind of turned to the corner, and then you started seeing drink responsibly promoted extensively by alcohol companies.
So if I could just one more thought on that. So when it comes to beer companies, and this is, I think, true of Coca-Cola as well, the one thing I can think of that ties their investments to their product is some of them are involved in water issues. Coca-Cola is one of the biggest water users in the world, and so water conservation, water supply issues are issues that they invest in, and I think some of the beer companies do that as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts, Sonia or Hector?
No experience.
The tough one? Yeah, there's a company called Altria in the U.S. that historically has been a big tobacco company, and they have, near as I can tell, and you could look up their reports and stuff, they seem to be participating in lots of diversity and inclusion and lots of other sort of social responsibility-oriented kinds of activities.
Yeah.
So I think this is actually a good time to shift gears again. And we'll take questions in a couple of minutes. But one observation that I want to make, it's kind of interesting that you hear, everybody's heard the term the bottom line. It's a very common term, right? The bottom line is what? Profits, right? Because on an income statement, the bottom line is literally profits, net income. Then there's another concept called the double bottom line. And the double bottom line is actually a term that's talked about a lot related to corporate social responsibility. And that is not only profits, but social good. And in fact, it was interesting, I read a little blurb in CSR Wire that talked about the triple bottom line. And they actually came up with a little tagline that people, profits, and planet. So they're talking about the triple bottom line of the traditional one, actually the order you might put in is profit because that's the single one. And then adding people and looking out for people and caring for people is the double. And then they're adding planet on as well with the environmental piece of it. So it seems to me that, one of the main issues with corporate social responsibility and the tone at the top, and it's almost like a decision that the company makes, and it's kind of simplistic, but do they care? Or by default, do they not really care? So does AT&T care about its people, its communities, its constituents? Does AT&T care about everybody? I think you would argue, yeah.
We walk the walk, we talk the talk when you have a board that is 1/3 female.
Yeah, well, and then to use older now example, Enron, I think you could argue that at the end of the day, they didn't, what they cared about most was money, and it was sort of greed out of control. I think you could argue that as a company, they didn't really care about other important factors, people and...
They gave a lot of money. They did give a lot of money to, the Philharmonic and the... But when it came to the actual operation of the company, no, I think you're absolutely right.
Well, it's interesting because you pointed out about the policies, and I know Enron had great policies.
Yeah.
Very well written, very well done, but it seemed like the action, there was quite a bit of a variance between what they actually did and their written policies. So before we start questions, I want to ask if you guys have any last thought you want to share, and we'll start with Hector.
Sure. Well, one point that, Pablo, I think is critical to is sometimes when a company or an individual or an organization, a state, a country, becomes good, it's very difficult to see the weaknesses. You get embroiled in this, I'm so good, I'm so great, how could I do wrong kind of thing. And I think sometimes it's healthy to try to find some way to look at us, either as companies or individuals or individuals who make up companies. And let me use the state of Texas as an example. Think of it as a company. Most of you probably have been aware now through the last 6-9 months, the very difficult challenge in financial times that we're going through in the state of Texas. But the interesting part to me is, it's not that we woke up yesterday and say, voila, we are now in deep trouble. It's if you look back that for the last 10 years, we are damn near the bottom in education, damn near the bottom in healthcare for children, damn near the bottom in almost all of the things that you think a society, would value and would place high value on it. So then I think when that is happening in a large community like that, and then we have a company or individuals that make up companies that operate in that state, then I think there is a social responsibility to see how can we contribute to making it better. Is there a possibility to actually do a self-examination? Am I making products that perhaps could help? Or is there a way that I could advocate? Because advocacy is also a very important aspect of what corporations can do. And our state, in addition to all the, and I'm picking on it because it's very easy for us to identify with it, that is facing such a big challenge with the largest growing population segment being the Hispanics, having the most difficult challenges in education and healthcare, then I think it's an appropriate time for all of us to step back and do a reflection on that and say, is there that those of us who operate here as companies, are there things that we could do that would help, that could create what I called earlier, share value, that would benefit us in the long run, but also would add, because I don't think taxes alone is going to do it. I don't think budget cuts alone are going to do it. So I really think we are in a unique situation in our country, more than any place that I've ever seen, to do some self-examination. I like to use the word great to talk about Texas and the U.S. But sometimes that word is harder to coming out of my mouth lately because it is probably the country with the greatest opportunity. But when you look at the measures of things that reflect social responsibility, we have lagged. And we need to at least be realistic and self-critical as corporations, as individuals, that perhaps is a good time to examine that and see what role we might be able to play in helping it make it better.
Great. David?
So there's just one other issue that I wanted to mention that I think has been sprinkled throughout the discussion, but I just wanted to bring it out as a separate issue. When we talk about being sort of investing in the community, being responsive to the community, at least in academic language, the way we talk about it in class is, we call that stakeholder relations, stakeholder engagement, engaging with the community, engaging with people who claim a stake in what your company is doing. And I think one of the places that companies who are well-meaning fall down on these issues is by not understanding that process or not addressing it in a systematic way and making sure that they're touching base with all the important constituents of the community, all the important stakeholders that they have. And so I just think it's worth making that an explicit part of a corporate social responsibility plan. And there are, and I think increasingly we are seeing companies do that, where they treat stakeholder engagement as something that is self-consciously an action that they take in a systematic way, a planned, systematic, and ongoing way, and as both the other speakers have said, integrated into all their other decision-making processes. Use that information they gain from talking to people in the community, knowing the mayor, knowing the daughter of the mayor, and all that sort of thing, and using that information to help them craft a better corporate social responsibility plan. So I just wanted to make sure we brought that out.
Yeah, and it seems like when stakeholders are discussed, oftentimes, the sort of obvious ones like shareholders and employees kind of come first or are highly touted or emphasized. So who are some of the other stakeholders that you would be referring to in stakeholder engagement?
So the way you would want to handle it, and the way that companies increasingly are handling it, is to be very self-conscious about the process from the beginning, from the start, which means identifying them in the first place, not waiting for stakeholders to come to you, either because they're obvious, they're your employees, they're shareholders, or because customers, or because they sue you, or whoever they are, they're protesting outside your facility. You go out and figure out who the important stakeholders are. You talk to your employees, you talk to other people in the community, and you learn who they are before they have a problem with you. And so you identify them, you prioritize them, you develop a relationship with them, and then you keep that process going.
Yeah, so elected representatives are...
Government's always a big
one.
stakeholder. Yeah, governments, NGOs, local people, community people, the people that are next to your plants or facilities or stores.
Yeah, people who live in the communities.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sonia?
I'll add that citizenship and sustainability is a fundamental operating system at AT&T, and it allows you to hire the best and the brightest of all races, of all ethnicities. It allows you to innovate and to invent so that your business can continue to grow and to evolve. It allows us to recognize our company's impact on society and those societal issues as well that impact our own company and our own employees. When it's a fundamental part of the operating system, it makes you a better company, a smarter company, a more responsive company. That's what we have found out over the 130 years of existence as a telecom company. And it's something that we thrive on because it's been very good for us.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of attracting the best and brightest, a while back, I had the pleasure of meeting Carmen Nava and interviewing her. She's Senior VP of UVerse for AT&T, and she was describing all of the mentorship and development and very sophisticated programs for attracting, serving, and retaining the best and brightest. Yes?
We have a Chief Talent and Diversity Officer. Her name is Cindy Brinkley, and one of the company's major initiatives is to create mentoring circles. I myself head a national mentoring circle that meets once a month. Hacemos was instrumental in creating the mentoring process within the company, and now it's an official initiative within the corporation.
Terrific.
Very proud of it.
And Hacemos actually won the USHCC Super Bowl of Hispanic Employee Resource Group programs. There was an article on it in Latino Leaders Magazine. So one last comment, and then we'll open it up for questions, and that is that talking about positioning of an organization, or in particular a company, for the short, mid, long term, one has to recognize the changing face of America. And that is that there is a transformation, a fundamental transformation of the structure of human capital as we know it in America is taking place right now. We're actually on the front edge of it. If you look at the 2010 census, you look at 50 million Hispanics, 1 out of 6 Americans, over $1 trillion in purchasing power, et cetera. That's interesting, and it's very big and very fast. But then on the other hand, you look at, in the next 29 years, 78 million Americans are going to go off the market. And that's the baby boom. And we're at the front edge of that 29 years. So what's going to happen is between now and around 2050, America's going to grow by around 100 million people. 2/3 of those 100 million people will be Hispanic. So during that time, the proportion of Anglos is going to drop by 20%. The proportion of African Americans is going to remain flat. Asians are going to grow rapidly, but on a small base, and Hispanics are going to nearly double. So I would propose that companies who are practicing a high level of corporate social responsibility are better preparing themselves for a changing environment and better preparing themselves to leverage human capital in America, and that those that aren't will be left behind in various ways. So I want to go ahead and open it up. We have about 20 minutes.
I think it's a reaction that corporate America is being put under a lot of pressure today by we've had a very difficult, challenging environment in the last several years, and we're going through an adjustment where, you know, the government doesn't really know where they're going to take healthcare benefits, for example. So this is all, I think we're going through a period of time of debate, exploring, finding. I'm very optimistic that out of all of these very difficult, chaotic scenarios we're going through, we're going to come up with a system that's going to lead to a balance on benefits and employee, the things that employees care about that will improve and be better. But it's not clear right now. And I think this it's not and the fact that they seem contradictory to the idea of CSR is because it is. It is. But at the same time, I haven't met a CEO of a company in the last several years who's not worried about how to deal through these things and hoping to come out in the next 2-3 years with something that, combined with what the government is going to do, will lead to a better environment for the employee base and be better off than we've been for a long time. And so it's a sign of confusing times and difficult times more than a desire to just take advantage of the employee or do that.
Yeah. My first reaction is that about employee pay and benefits having to do with what the market will bear, competition, and also what the company can bear to pay, as opposed to going offshore. David.
One quick point. So these competitive pressures are there and will remain there. However, I think the spread of CSR is not just is also there in the market. So you made reference to this earlier, Pablo, when you talked about the ISO standards. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, if you're a supplier of a major company, there's a chance that you might see the ISO 26000 standards built into the requirements of that contract. It certainly happened with environmental standards 30 years ago, and now you see it's common for ISO 14000 standards, which are the environmental standards.
And quality as well.
Irrespective of any rules or regulations that the government creates for your procurers to require you to comply with those standards. And so you're right, those pressures are there, and there's always the argument that we're going to lose out to competitors if we spend money on CSR, or if we spend money on higher labor or higher wages. And
or
I
if
would,
you don't.
but there's also might be an argument. I mean, these things are finding their way into the market as well, and so in those ways, so that's a little bit of a countervailing force. I don't know how big a one it is.
You know, the sense that I have is that the larger a company is, the more likely they are to invest in CSR and take on CSR. Fortune 1000. If you look at that's my gut feeling.
Right.
You could go research it, but the larger you go, I think the broader the reach, more operating more communities, concerned about reputation, possibility something could happen that would impact them negatively goes up, et cetera. So that's the sense also, just as a quick follow-on. And just a quick side note, and that is that during that period of time I mentioned, the U.S. will become a majority-minority country. California, Texas, New Mexico, and Hawaii are already majority-minority states. California and Texas are both between about 38% Hispanic. And so, so that's a quick side note that
just because right now we're at a disadvantage, and so how do we?
Yeah. So the question is, after education,
what's the next
the next highest priority or the next step?
Well, for us, it's education, 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 but as an individual, that I can tell you that there are organizations all across the country that are championing minority business, supporting minority business, being engaged with organizations that advocate on their behalf, organizations like the U.S. Hispanic Chamber, and all the training and information and certification knowledge that they have for those businesses. You know, we're one of 17 companies that spent more than $1 billion last year across the country with minority vendors. You know, there are minority vendors there, and I believe the more that they can learn about the certification process in doing business with corporate America, the better they're going to be, the more they're going to be able to pay that forward and help other businesses grow and become part of the process. So education, 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 and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, business ownership. Hector?
Well, when you took education to the side, you took the big one. You know, that really is important. But there are two things that in the way we run our society are critically important. It's economic power and political power. Economic power comes from figuring out how do we encourage entrepreneurship in our communities. And we all have to figure out, there are various ways of doing that. As one example, you know, I'm chairman of the board of an organization called EDCO here in Austin, whose whole purpose is to find underrepresented people who want to start a new business, that we can invest in them and encourage them to get going. And the end goal of that is to create economic power in the community. The other one is political power. We have, you know, of all the potential people that can vote in, and I'm going to use Texas, of all the potential people that can vote in Texas, only half of them are registered to vote. And of those, only half of them voted in the last election. Therefore, our political power is diminished significantly with such a low level of participation. So in addition to the education that we put aside, the economic power that we need to create, which is important in our country, and also to find a way to empower our people politically by figuring out a way that we get that very large number of voters to care, to register, and by this is not a partisan effort. This is let the parties figure out how to earn the votes of the people. The power will be significant. Let me give you one example. Is if the people that are Hispanic in Texas that are registered to vote had voted in the governor's election, Bill White would have won if the same percentage of votes that Hispanics voted for him would have continued in the people that didn't vote. I don't know if that sounds clear or not, but the idea is the power of that vote is incredibly important.
It all goes back to I think what I addressed earlier, unless I'm completely missing where you're going with that. Educating your biggest champions, your employees, so that they can understand the type of impact they're making on the job every day and as part of a larger team. They're your biggest fans, they're your biggest base. That's why we spend a lot of time communicating with our employees to assure that they understand how they're making that impact. And for us, that's what it's all about.
I think there are a lot of examples of companies that are doing a good job trying to do that. You know, IBM does some very innovative things to get employees involved, and I'm sure AT&T has similar or better things too. At the end of the day, it's the top of the house setting the example, the tone at the top, because that encourages. The word I use is it gives people permission to participate, and you know. I know that employees, and I know this firsthand, employees feel very empowered to do things like take time off work if necessary, volunteer on weekends, and wear T-shirts that have the name of their company. They feel very good about it if they sense that empowerment, which, you know, companies like AT&T and IBM and others, I'm sure, do a great job of that.
And you make a great point, and to take days off to attend a company-funded employee resource group conference, you know, once a year, that kind of thing. They're very, very proud to be who they are, and it means so much to know that their employer supports that. speaking for a technology company, we do not believe that technology can be legislated. For us, it's all about consumer demand and being able to provide products and services that leave as little impact on the environment as possible. So we're champions about allowing the customer to drive the entire process rather than the government. Yeah.
You raise an interesting question about government regulation and CSR as kind of substitutes for each other, or government regulation forcing CSR as well. There are some people who think that CSR is a bad thing because it removes momentum or lessens momentum for government to regulate in certain areas. I think Robert Reich, who was the Clinton administration's labor secretary, held this view. He thought corporate social responsibility expenditures were not a good thing because government ought to be establishing these standards.
So companies should be irresponsible, so
well, yeah,
the government is forced to come in and then regulate them?
I don't want to put those words in his mouth, but he was hostile to it. He probably was quite skeptical about how real it was as well. And those of us who have worked, these two have worked much more intimately with it within their own companies than I have, but the companies that I've worked with, it certainly appears real to me. But they are, in a sense, substitutes. I said earlier that if you do business in the United States and you emit pollutants, for example, there's laws that tell you how much you can emit. You go to do the same activity in some other parts of the world, there are no such laws. And so if a lot of companies voluntarily hold themselves to a standard that goes beyond the law, that is more stringent than the law requires, but some don't. And so in that case, you would want government to step in and impose limits.
I think that there's a role for the government to play that can complement what the corporate social responsibility effort is. For example, and I'll go back to the example I used earlier, if a company needs to retrain workers and they're going through a transition in technology or whatever, I think the government, through tax benefits, through things that they could do, they could encourage that company to more aggressively pursue that versus shipping the jobs overseas. And I'll give you one trivial little example. My wife and I are big fanatics of anytime we buy something, we try very hard to see if we can find it made in the USA. So we Google it and try every possible thing. And I'm amazed about how many things are actually made in this country that we didn't even know. I'll give you an example. We wanted to buy for a group of people that were not financially strong blue jeans for them to have. And we thought every blue jean I ever saw said made in either China or Vietnam, something like that. So we started Googling, and we found this little company in Georgia that 100% of the things is made in the US, and it's actually the same price as the jeans you buy at Walmart, which are made in China. Now, I never knew that. And so I started interacting with them to learn, why did you do that? Well, it turned out to be is that they were able to retrain with a state grant all their employees to figure out a way that they could be more effective at using automated equipment. They got a grant to be able to invest and all that. Now they have this facility and they're very proud. They actually tell you where every piece of the jean comes from. They tell you the cotton comes from Mississippi, the brass things they use come from Tennessee, and all these things. And all I'm pointing out is that the role of the government, it can be positive, but it has to be careful that it doesn't stifle the other things. Another example of that, where I think it's a good example, there's an iPhone app that probably Sony's aware of. There's an iPhone app that surprised me how effective it is at helping Hispanics, in particularly, battle diabetes. And again, it's you want to make sure the government doesn't regulate that, so it makes it harder for people to reach it out. But it's an amazing, simple little app that if somebody takes it seriously can do a tremendous job, and especially the Hispanic community who has such an issue with diabetes. But those are two examples, one in one end when you don't want the government to interfere with it because it's great. The other one where, yeah, you do need some help. You need some help where the government could play a role.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a good one, and I guess just a quick reaction and then one more question and then we'll wrap it up, and that is that the government has voluminous regulations on the environment. And the government also has voluminous regulations on labor, and also entities like the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. And so there are a number of areas where the government has done a lot that you could argue they've already regulated corporate social responsibilities if you argue that environment and labor are part of it, right? And so it's a very interesting question to look then, where do you take that? There's been some legislation regulation on corporate governance after Enron and many of the debacles, WorldCom and others. Sarbanes-Oxley was created to put a number of requirements on boards of directors. And the goal was to try to get boards to do a better job. And so, I would go with, how do you define corporate social responsibility, and what areas are there already regulations, and then sort of what's the need and where do you take it? Do you then tell corporations, hey, everyone has to give 5% of their profits, like Target does? I mean, that would be a pretty tall order or fairly intense regulation, but could you argue that that's something that needs to be done? I don't know. Good question.
We hold our employees to the highest level of integrity, responsibility, and accountability. Now, going back and answering your question, but going back to the previous questioner's comments, you don't just wake up one day and decide you're going to be operating with integrity. It's something that's part of the culture. And without having the ability to comment on anything within the legal sphere, because that's not what I do, I will tell you that my company is very strict about holding every one of our employees to a code of business conduct, which they are mandated to review and to sign off on every year as long as they're employed with AT&T. It holds our employees to the strictest standards, and confidentiality is at the heart of everything that we do. We build the infrastructure that has enabled the processes that you mentioned. We work with, we actually do work with the best systems to assure that we have the tools in place to provide the checks and balances that keep the customer's confidential information just that. And I really don't know how more specifically to answer your question than that.
Well, this has been a great panel, terrific conversation about corporate social responsibility with a good mix of perspectives and a variety of takes on different issues, both just practical, frontline, down to earth from a CEO who ran a publicly traded company for 10 years, from a current president of a regional AT&T Louisiana, and then also from a professor who has drilled down into this issue extensively and also linked it to industry and linked it to the real world, if you will. So if you could please give a hand of applause.